Okay, so Larry asked me to talk a bit about a data-driven approach to enhancing mission-aligned admissions. Um, I'm going to, hopefully, I'm going to advance my slide. Can someone tell me whether they can see it or see the next slide? Just say yes, please.
Yes.
I can't
Yes.
see faces. Thank you. All right. So in terms of the agenda, we're going to basically talk about data-driven, mission-based admissions in terms of 5 steps. And I'll go through each one of the steps. Before I get into each step, though, let me just share with you a little bit of background. So I currently serve on the advisory committee for advancing holistic review and admissions for the AAMC. And that organization has been around for a long time now as holistic admissions has developed and disseminated across virtually every medical school in the country, more or less. And we were involved in a number of relatively new research projects. And I'm going to just touch very briefly on one of them in this presentation. But needless to say that a vital aspect of advancing primary care in medical school admissions must involve making primary care a central piece of your admissions process. And I just want to piggyback off what you heard from Ashley, which is, pipeline is an essential aspect of any admissions process, largely because it represents a very active way of changing your applicant pool. Without a diverse applicant pool that reflects the interests of primary care, you will not admit students that are oriented that way, and you will absolutely struggle to encourage existing medical students to change their hearts and minds around primary care. To really advance primary care appreciably, you have to select for it in your admissions process. And in order to do that, you need to have an applicant pool from which to select from that has a potentiation for primary care. So the first step I'd like to outline is that primary care has to be a vital aspect of the admissions mission. And that can be the same as a medical school mission, or it may be different. And it really does hinge on the current circumstance in the history of the admissions committee and its relative connectivity and alignment with the leadership of the College of Medicine. In some cases, there's very clear and direct alignment between the mission of the medical school and the medical school admissions mission, and sometimes there is not. So for example, you might have a mission that articulates things like primary care, serving the medically underserved, embracing diversity in all of its forms. But when you look at what's actually the core elements of the mission of the admissions committee, you find that actually, in fact, it's academic metrics that's king. And so the first thing you must do is ensure that primary care is truly a vital aspect of your admissions mission and its associated processes. And the good news is there's a national model for this, and it is called holistic review. It's been around for a long time. When medical schools were recently surveyed a few years back, the typical response was that medical school admissions processes were about 80% truly holistic. Now that's self-perceived data that I'm quoting there. And in fact, it may or may not be truly at an 80% level of adoption, but that's what people think. And that's where testing your admissions process is key. There's one thing about what people think they're doing in admissions, and there's another thing in terms of what's actually being produced as a consequence of admissions. And that basic framework of holistic review has 3 parts, and it's experiences, attributes, and academic metrics. And it's referred to as the EAM model. And there's a nice little graphic here that suggests what the EAM model is. And you'll see in the center of that graphic, it's metrics, which are basically grades and test scores. And then the outer 2 rings are what are referred to as attributes. Attributes would be attached to things like characteristics that are more allied with primary care. And so that might be, for example, the capacity to connect with others, an interest in serving in direct care roles with patients as opposed to consulting services. It's those kinds of human characteristics that we all know ally with certain medical specialties, whether it be a primary care, family medicine type specialty, or orthopedic surgeon type specialty. There are very different attributes, personal attributes, that separate people into those specialties. And then the outer rings are around experiences. What have students done that signify their relative alignment with the mission of that medical school and the preparation to be successful in medical school? So metrics, attributes, and experiences. And what I would say is, if you wish to admit more students that are oriented towards primary care, you need to take a careful examination of all three categories. And you need to examine it not only in terms of your immediate admissions criteria, but also to relate what you're collecting in admissions with later outcomes. It's one thing to think that you're admitting students who are more oriented towards primary care. It's another thing to actually test it. And so a fundamental question for the group just to think about for a minute is, how many of your schools explicitly state some version of primary care in their mission? And I'd be curious, by show of hands, how many of you are in a medical school that explicitly state either primary care or family medicine or some variant in your actual mission statement? Okay, so we got one thumbs up. Just one. Oh, there's two. Oh, thumbs down. Is that a thumbs down for Judy? Yes, thumbs down. So there's a thumbs up for Hannah. So let me show you some data. Now, this data is a little old, and it's because it's a part of an ongoing research project that has many facets to it. I'll just give you a tangent here to say we're actually looking at admissions data for 8 years, and we're able to use every single applicant for all 8 years in this analysis. And in this analysis, we started with the admissions year of 2009, 2010. And so that's why I'm going to show you some mission data from the year prior to that. And what this slide basically shows you in the upper right is, during that time of 2008, 2009, only about a quarter of all medical schools actually stated explicitly primary care in their mission statement. The rest did not. When we included other characteristics like primary care, medically underserved, and diversity as constructs within the mission statement, here's the distribution. So over 50% of all medical schools did not state primary care, nor medically underserved, nor any aspect of diversity in their mission statement. And only 2% of all schools actually stated explicitly those three characteristics in their mission statement. Just a little trivia question there. Any ideas who and it ends up being basically 2 schools. Any ideas what schools they might be? So the 2 schools are Morehouse Medical School and Wright State Medical College. Those are the 2. Okay, so the illustration there is important because mission is supposed to drive our admissions process. And if the constructs associated with your goals, in this case, advancing family medicine and primary care, if that's your goal, in order for it to stand a strong chance of being a priority within your admissions process, it needs to be at least in the mission of the admissions committee, and it also benefits from being in the mission of the medical school. The second step that helps with potentiating these positive outcomes at admissions is to have a framework. And that framework is important because it ultimately becomes the rubric by which the admissions committee scores applicants and ultimately decides who to interview, and then ultimately decides who to make seat offers to. And I propose that an admissions framework to advance primary care could have at least 3 powerful elements. And those 3 elements are primary care, service to the medically underserved, and valuing and reflecting diversity. And the reason why I propose these as 3 powerful constructs within an admissions process is because there's a lot of research out there that suggests that they reinforce each other. In other words, students who have an interest in primary care also tend to source from have experiences with, and are committed to serving the medically underserved. And those students that are committed to serving the medically underserved also tend to source from, have experiences with, and a commitment to underserved and underrepresented populations in medical education today. And of course, those students who tend to be underrepresented also have a higher propensity to entering into primary care in the medically underserved. And so when you emphasize all three concurrently within your admissions process, it can have this reinforcing effect, both in terms of the strength of that commitment in every applicant that you admit with those criteria, but then even if you're also admitting students that only demonstrate one or the other, it still potentiates the other two. And so just focusing on primary care alone, I believe is an important characteristic, but not necessarily sufficient in reinforcing what your ultimate outcome is, because it's not just about admitting a student with a commitment to primary care. It's creating a community of students who support and reinforce one another in their overall goals and aspirations. And so if you can compose a community of students that reflect this tripartite set of goals, experiences, attributes, you have, I think, a better chance of reinforcing the outcomes that you wish to achieve in terms of primary care. Moving on, I think we also just need to recognize and appreciate the challenge and the opportunity. So this is a graphic that shows how race ethnic distribution is changing in our country. And you'll see this data is old. It's from 2010, which was the last census. As you all know, we're in the throes of a new census, so these data will be updated. But what this shows you is how the demographics of our country are changing, and they're changing appreciably. We are shifting from a majority Caucasian nation to becoming a majority minority nation. And that flip will happen in about 2050, when the minority of the minority races in our country today will become, as a cluster, the majority, and Caucasians will no longer be in the majority. And just to give you a sense of how that looks, in 2010, if you were under the age of 5 years old, as a population, we were nearly at the flip point already. So in other words, in 2010, now we project out to 2020, these kids that were under 5 are now roughly under 15 years old, right? So it is to say that the population of students that are now thinking about going to undergrad and eventually will be thinking about going to medical school just in a few years later, the largest fraction of them will be of an underrepresented minority group. And so if your admissions process is not retooling and adjusting now, you're going to be desperately behind the curve in just a few years. So that's one scope of the problem. Another scope of the problem is that we know, and you don't have to pour over the details, I'll just tell you, we know that there's a widening divide between kids who go to college and get a college degree by income level as compared to those who don't. And so the top lines, the blue line and the yellow line, is the percentage of kids from families in the top quartile and the second top quartile of income, and what percentage of them get a bachelor's degree. And you'll see that it's 62% for the top quartile and 47% for the next quartile down. Whereas for kids from families in the bottom two quartiles, it's under half that. And you're also probably noticing the pattern, which is a widening divide between the top two and the bottom two quartiles. So when we're talking about admitting students for and from economically distressed communities, because they have a commitment to the medically underserved more so, and they also have a commitment to primary care, the research shows us that, well, it's appreciably more difficult to find them in higher ed, and especially graduating from higher ed. And that's another part of our challenge. A third area of challenge is that we're continuing to see a gap between Caucasian adults and African-American adults in terms of four-year degree completion. While everybody is going up, there is a gap. And that gap is also defined by gender. And so, unfortunately, as these gaps continue to widen, it's increasingly difficult to find African American men who are even graduating with a four-year degree, let alone qualifying for medical education. So in the end, we have to recognize that in order to truly advance this tripartite goal of primary care, medically underserved, and diversity, it's going to involve systems change. And that's why I really appreciated Ashley's remarks around how we enact systems change in this regard. And just like Ashley signaled, given the scope of the problem, given the scope of the problem, partnerships are essential. And so I appreciated her remarks around the partnerships with HOSA. A fourth step is, as you're enacting a new way of focusing in admissions and admitting students with the characteristics that potentiate your outcome of primary care, you need to evaluate how your admissions process is working. And so I'm going to take another little pause here for a second. I'm going to ask everybody, how do you evaluate the quality of your admissions process in terms of producing the outcomes you seek, in this case, more family physicians? And I can give you the answer because I used to be an admissions dean of a medical school. The answer is every year when we'd have the match, people would either turn to me and say, "Good job, Eric," or they'd say, "What was that admissions committee thinking?" Right? And I would turn back to them and I would say, "You see those kids that are getting their match letters right now? I haven't really interacted with them in 4 years. I don't think it had, I mean, maybe it has something to do with us, right? Maybe, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in medical school too that might have an intervening effect, whether you want to call it the manifest curriculum or the hidden curriculum." And so I bring that up because I do believe firmly that admissions can play a powerful role, and it does. There are many intervening factors that play into it as well. Did my slides go away, by the way? They did, yeah. Okay, hold on a second. And so what that ultimately means is that we shouldn't be waiting for the match to evaluate admissions. And another way of saying it is, when you look at the predictive power of admissions data, in general, it's like all longitudinal data. Its best capacity to predict is in the M1 year. So in this case, commitment to primary care, commitment to the medically underserved in M1. Its weakest power to predict is beyond and into practice. And so we need a system that evaluates the impact of admissions much closer in the medical education continuum than waiting for the match. And so a longitudinal system is absolutely essential. And here's your typical continuum from recruitment to applications to matriculation into M1 and M4 and into the residency years. This is our typical way of evaluating. We admit them and then we wait 5 to 6 years to figure out their second year or their first year of residency. And what I'm encouraging is that we need to evaluate primary care, medically underserved, and diversity elements in our student body all the way through in a longitudinal way to see if in fact our recruitment efforts are yielding applicants who truly have a higher and disproportionate commitment to these three things. We then need to evaluate the aspects of our admissions process accordingly. We need to see who we get, and then we need to see if they maintain those commitments over the medical school years, which ultimately means we need to be evaluating in each phase, and then we need to be feedbacking the results of each phase back to the previous phase so that we can create these virtuous mini continuous quality improvement cycles for each phase. In order to do this, we have to capture the data. And you might be asking, well, Eric, how are we going to get all these data? My goodness, I mean, you're basically suggesting that we build a whole an evaluation enterprise with hardly any resources. Yeah, I kind of am, but I'm going to give you a little bit of help in this arena. And that is that the AAMC actually collects some of these data for you. And so I've taken the trouble of going through every national assessment that the AAMC offers to medical students from the point of application, which is the MCAS, into the M1 year, which is the MSQ, M2 year, Y2Q, and then the graduating student questionnaire and anything that goes on in residency. And I've actually given you verbatim the questions that are asked in those surveys. And as you might know, you can actually request these data from the AAMC for your school. And so you don't necessarily have to specially collect it. You can request it, and then you can see to what extent do your M1 students demonstrate a commitment to primary care. And you can then relate that to what's happening in your admissions process to see if the change in admissions practices are actually yielding any change whatsoever in M1 students' commitment to primary care. And then you can check to see how it relates from M1 to M2, and then on to the fourth year. So the data are being collected for you. And so I just encourage you to maximize the existing data. If you're interested in collecting more data, then I've also given you in the slide some things that you might look at. Everything from the choices that students are making in terms of any primary care tracks you offer or optional primary care coursework, to their performance in courses that ally with primary care, like psychosocial skills and medical interviewing, to just tracking which students are engaged in extracurricular activities. It's just a simple yes/no question: are they present or not? And then relating that back to your admissions practices. And then ongoing surveys. Of these, my preference is on observable behaviors over surveys, and some of these are clearly observable and can be readily collected. And ultimately then, once you've learned something from your data, which is pretty straightforward to do once you have it, it's enacting a quality improvement process so that you're regularly sharing the results back with your admissions committee that you're discovering, and you're encouraging them to continue to adjust their practices to the extent that they're willing and able to emphasize primary care, medically underserved, and diversity in their admissions rubric. And then finally, I suggest brace for impact and lean in, because if you're successful, you will see a change in the nature of your student body. And it won't just be about commitment to primary care, right? Because we know primary care is associated with diversity, and primary care is associated with engagement with the medically underserved. So you're going to see fundamental changes in your student body, and they're going to come with different desires, different needs, different expectations. And so it cannot be just about holistic admissions. It has to be about holistic student affairs. And there's a lot of work going on right now within AAMC with this new idea of holistic student affairs, which is the next phase after holistic admissions. So I'm going to leave it there and open it up for questions or comment.